I didn't realize how much space she had taken up in my life until one evening when she wasn't speaking, just sitting there across from me, calm as always. The room felt warmer when she was around, like her presence softened the edges of everything. She had that way about her, unhurried, grounded, as if she had already survived the storms I was still learning how to name. She was in her early 40s, but she wore her age with a quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention. It showed in the way she listened, in how she didn't rush to fill silence. When she spoke, her voice was steady, reassuring, the kind that made you believe things would eventually make sense. I found myself leaning into that certainty more often than I meant to. We sat close on the couch, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Not quite. There was always that careful inch of space, like an unspoken agreement we both understood. Every now and then, when I hesitated or searched for the right words, her hand would find my forearm. It was never sudden, just a gentle weight, warm through the fabric of my sleeve, grounding me. Each time, my thoughts slowed, as if her touch gave me permission to breathe again. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just grateful. She listened when others didn't. She remembered small details about my life, things even I forgot to say out loud. When I doubted myself, she didn't correct me. She simply asked questions that led me back to my own answers. Felt safe with her. Familiar. Like sitting beside a steady fire on a cold night. Sometimes our conversations drifted into quiet pauses. Not awkward ones. The kind where words weren't necessary. I would catch her watching me then, her gaze thoughtful, soft, as if she was seeing more than I was saying. When our eyes met, she would smile gently and look away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The moment always lingered longer than it should have. I didn't question it at first. I told myself this was what support looked like. That needing someone didn't mean weakness, it meant connection. Still, there were moments when I wondered why her reassurance mattered so much to me. Why her approval felt heavier than anyone else's. Why I waited for her messages before deciding how my day had gone. That night, as the light from the lamp cast long shadows across the room, she leaned back slightly inside, the kind of tired sigh that carried years in it. Without thinking, I shifted closer. Our arms brushed. She didn't move away. Instead, she rested her hand briefly against mine, fingers relaxed, not holding, just there. In that simple touch, I felt comfort. And something else too. A quiet dependence I wasn't ready to name yet. It didn't happen all at once. Doubt never does. It arrived in small, almost invisible moments, so subtle I ignored them at first. A pause where there used to be certainty. A smile that felt practiced instead of spontaneous. Nothing I could point to, nothing dramatic enough to confront. Just a feeling that settled in my chest and stayed there. She was still kind, still attentive. If anything, she became even more reassuring, as if she sensed the shift before I did. Whenever I spoke about my fears or frustrations, she leaned in closer, her voice softening, wrapping her words around me like a blanket. "You're doing fine," she'd say. "You'll figure it out." And I wanted to believe her, because believing her meant I didn't have to look too closely at what felt off. One afternoon, we sat across from each other at the small table by the window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching in the lines of her face. Lines that spoke of experience, of lessons learned the hard way. She listened as I talked, nodding slowly, fingers curled around her mug. When I finished, she smiled, but it came a heartbeat late. Just long enough for me to notice. I wondered what she was thinking in that space between listening and responding. Was she choosing her words carefully? Or choosing not to say something at all? There were moments when I caught her changing the subject gently, steering the conversation away from certain topics. Not abruptly, never like that. She was too thoughtful for that. It was more like a soft redirection, a careful hand on the wheel. If I asked about the future, she brought us back to the present. If I spoke about defining things, she talked about patience. Each time, her touch found mine, light and grounding, as if to remind me that whatever the question was, the answer didn't matter as much as how safe I felt. And that was the problem. Safety started to feel like a substitute, comfort replacing clarity. I noticed how often she reassured me instead of answering me, how she met uncertainty with warmth instead of truth. The more I paid attention, the harder it was to ignore. Still, I said nothing. Part of me feared that naming it would break something fragile between us. Once, as we walked side by side in the evening air, our shoulders brushing with each step, I slowed down just to stay close to her. She glanced at me, reached out, and squeezed my hand briefly. "Don't overthink," she said with a smile. The words were gentle, but they landed heavier than she knew, because I was thinking, more than ever. I realized then that I wasn't questioning her intentions. I was questioning my place, whether I was being guided or quietly held in place, whether the comfort she offered was meant to help me grow, or simply to keep me near. That night, lying awake, I replayed our conversations, searching for what wasn't said. And in that silence, I understood something unsettling. Sometimes the absence of truth isn't a lie, it's just a delay. And I was starting to feel the weight of waiting. I didn't plan the moment. I just reached a point where the questions inside me grew louder than my fear of the answers. We were sitting together again, the way we always did, close enough to feel each other's presence but careful not to cross any lines. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the evening, and for once, the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt heavy. I stared at my hands, resting in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. She noticed, of course. She always did. She turned toward me, her expression open, patient, the same calm readiness she offered every time I struggled. "What's going on?" she asked gently. I looked up at her then, really looked, at the way her eyes held concern, at the familiar warmth in her face. This was the moment I usually backed down, accepted reassurance, let things stay the way they were. But something in me had shifted. I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't searching for something more solid. "I need to ask you something," I said. My voice sounded quieter than I expected, but it didn't shake. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded, giving me her full attention. That alone almost stopped me. Almost. I told her how I felt, carefully, honestly, that I was confused, that sometimes it felt like she was protecting me from answers instead of giving them. I said I wasn't accusing her of anything, only trying to understand where I stood. Each word felt like stepping onto thin ice, but once I started, I couldn't stop. When I finished, the space between us felt wider than before. She inhaled slowly, eyes dropping to my hands as if searching for the right response. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached out and covered my hand with hers. Her touch was warm, familiar, comforting in the exact way it always had been. My shoulders relaxed without my permission. She squeezed gently, her thumb brushing against my skin. "You still need me," she said softly, not as a question, as reassurance. The words settled between us, and for a second, I almost accepted them. Almost let that sentence replace everything I had asked. It would have been easy to nod, to let the comfort win, to stay in the safety of being understood without being answered. But I realized then that her response wasn't about clarity. It was about care. She was answering my fear, not my question. I looked at our hands, still joined, and felt the familiar pull, the part of me that wanted to stay right there, held in that certainty. Slowly, I drew a breath and met her gaze again. I saw something flicker in her eyes then. Not confidence, not control, fear. In that moment, I understood something important. Needing someone isn't the same as being seen by them. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which one she was offering me. I didn't pull my hand away right away. I let it stay there for a moment longer than necessary, as if my body needed time to catch up with the decision my mind had already made. Her palm was still warm against mine, steady and reassuring. The same touch that had anchored me so many times before. But now, instead of calming me, it made the silence feel heavier. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, and gently eased my hand back. Not abruptly, not with rejection, just enough to create space. The absence of her touch felt louder than any words either of us could have spoken. She noticed immediately. Her fingers lingered in the air for a second before falling back to her lap. She searched my face, concern softening into something more fragile. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still calm, but thinner now. I held her gaze. My heart was pounding, but there was a strange clarity underneath the fear. "I don't doubt that I need you," I said quietly. "But that's not what I'm asking anymore." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I needed the truth more," I continued. Saying it out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't step back over. Not comfort, not reassurance, just honesty about where this is, about what you're holding back. The room seemed to still around us. Even the familiar warmth between us felt different now, exposed. She looked away first, eyes dropping to the floor as if the answer she'd been avoiding had finally caught up with her. Her shoulders rose with a slow inhale, then fell. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said after a long pause. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. But not knowing hurts too. That was when her composure cracked. Not dramatically, not in tears. Just a small shift. The confidence she usually carried so effortlessly loosened, revealing something quieter underneath. She clasped her hands together, rubbing her thumb against her knuckle. A nervous habit I'd never seen before. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I said everything out loud, you'd see me differently. Or worse, you'd leave." The honesty in her voice landed softly, but firmly. I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, but understanding. For the first time, she wasn't guiding the moment. She was standing inside it with me. "I wasn't asking because I wanted to go," I said. "I was asking because I needed to know where I was standing." She looked back at me then, really looked. There was no reassurance in her eyes this time, no carefully chosen words, just vulnerability. "I thought keeping you close was enough," she said quietly. "I didn't realize it was costing you clarity." We sat there, facing each other in that truth, neither reaching for the other. And even without the comfort of her touch, I felt something steadier than before. Because for the first time, we weren't hiding behind safety. We were choosing honesty, even if it meant everything would change after this. After the truth surfaced, neither of us rushed to fill the space it created. The room felt different now, quieter, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that followed honesty, where every breath carried meaning. She shifted slightly in her seat, turning toward me, as if deciding whether to step fully into what she had already begun to say. "I should have been braver," she said at last. Her voice wasn't trembling, but it wasn't as steady as before either. "I've spent so much of my life being the one who knows better, who keeps things together. I didn't expect to feel unsure again." She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. They were elegant, careful, hands that had carried responsibility for years. Now they were still, almost tentative. "When you came into my life," she continued, "you reminded me of parts of myself I thought I'd outgrown. Curiosity, hope, the feeling of being needed." The word needed hung between us. I understood it differently now, not as reassurance but as confession. She leaned back slightly, exhaling. "I told myself I was helping you, and in many ways I was, but I also liked how safe it felt to be important to you, to matter in a way that didn't ask me to risk too much." I listened without interrupting, my chest tightening with a mix of empathy and clarity. This wasn't manipulation. It was fear wearing the shape of care. "I've already lived through choices that didn't turn out the way I hoped," she said softly. "At my age, you start protecting what little certainty you have left. I didn't want to reach for something that could disappear." She finally looked at me then, eyes open and unguarded. "And you," she said, "you were standing at the beginning of things. I didn't want to be the reason you questioned yourself, or the reason you stayed when you should have been moving forward." Her words settled deeply. I realized how much she had been carrying quietly, the tension between wanting closeness and fearing consequence. She wasn't holding me in place to control me. She was holding on because letting go meant facing her own vulnerability. We sat closer now, not touching, but aligned. Our shoulders angled toward each other, breaths steadying in the same rhythm. I could feel the urge to reach out, to offer comfort, but I held back. This moment wasn't about soothing. It was about understanding. "I don't regret what we shared," she said. "I just regret not trusting you with the truth sooner." I nodded slowly. In her confession, I didn't hear excuses. I heard a woman acknowledging her limits, her fears, and her humanity. And in that honesty, something shifted between us, not toward romance, but toward respect. For the first time, I saw her not as someone who steadied me, but as someone who had been quietly unsteady herself. After everything was said, neither of us stood up right away. There was no sudden need to escape the moment. The honesty we had shared didn't push us apart. It settled us into a calmer understanding. Whatever we were before had shifted, but it hadn't broken. She was the first to speak again. "So where does that leave us?" Her tone wasn't anxious, just sincere. It wasn't a question meant to corner me. It was an invitation to decide together. I thought about it carefully, about how much she had meant to me, about how much I had grown in her presence, and how much I had nearly stopped growing because of it. I said slowly, "it means we stop leaning on what's comfortable and start being honest about what we can actually give." She nodded, considering my words. A small, thoughtful smile touched her lips. Not the reassuring one I was used to, but something quieter. "That sounds fair." We shifted closer without thinking, not crossing lines, just closing the emotional distance that had existed when things were unsaid. Our shoulders brushed, light and familiar. She let out a soft laugh, the tension easing from her posture. "You've changed," she said. "Not in a bad way." "I had to," I replied. She studied me for a moment, then reached out, not to hold my hand, but to rest her palm briefly against my shoulder. The touch was simple, grounding, free of expectation. Felt different now. Honest. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words surprised me, not because I hadn't heard them before, but because this time they didn't feel like reassurance meant to keep me close. They felt like recognition. We talked then about what we'd been to each other, about how she had offered stability when I needed it, and how I had brought energy into a life that had grown careful. We acknowledged the line we had walked so closely without crossing, and how easily it could have become something heavier if neither of us had stopped to ask why. There was no need to define ourselves with labels. No promises made to soften the goodbye. Just clarity. At one point, she stood and I followed. We faced each other in the quiet room, closer than we'd ever been, yet strangely more at ease. She opened her arms and I stepped into them. The hug was warm and lingering, familiar but final in a way that felt respectful. Her cheek rested briefly against mine, her breath steady. "Thank you," she murmured, "not for staying, not for needing her, but for being honest." When we pulled apart, there was no regret in her expression, just understanding. Whatever we had been, we had met each other honestly until the next morning. I left her apartment carrying a quiet weight, but also a strange lightness. The night before had peeled away layers of uncertainty, and while the answers hadn't led to the comfort I was used to, they gave me something more important: clarity. I knew now that what I had needed all along wasn't reassurance. It was truth, and she had given it, even at the risk of discomfort. The air outside was crisp, tinged with the scent of winter leaves and faint smoke from nearby chimneys. I pulled my coat tighter, letting the chill remind me that I was still moving forward, still standing on my own. Each step down the sidewalk felt deliberate, a rhythm that echoed my internal resolve. I could still feel her presence in the space beside me, not physically, but in memory. The way her gaze had held mine the night before, searching, vulnerable, honest. I paused at the corner, looking back at the building. Through the fogged window, I imagined her there, perhaps sipping tea, watching for some sign that I had stayed. But I didn't. I had learned something crucial. Sometimes love or care isn't about holding on. It's about letting the other person grow, and letting yourself grow in the process. Her words from last night played in my mind, soft but unyielding. "I'm proud of you." Not proud because I stayed or because I needed her, but proud because I had chosen honesty over comfort, truth over dependence. That was something we had built together, something no physical closeness could capture. The connection remained, but in a different form, one that wouldn't tie me to anyone else's fears or compromises. I could almost hear her soft laughter behind me, the echo of shared understanding in the way we had talked, the way we had paused to consider each other's hearts. There was no bitterness, no lingering questions that demanded immediate answers, only a profound awareness that our paths had crossed in a way that changed me forever. She had given me clarity, and I had given her acknowledgement. As I walked further, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me, gratitude for her presence, for the lessons she had unknowingly taught me, and for the courage to face the truth even when it was difficult. The pull of attachment, the kind I had felt for so long, had softened into something lighter, almost like a gentle push forward. I wasn't walking away from her. I was walking toward the person I could finally trust myself to be. When I reached the end of the block, I stopped and took a deep breath. The city around me felt alive and expansive, full of possibilities. And in that moment, I understood that this was the way love often worked. Not in holding tightly, but in learning, in honesty, and in growth. I kept walking, steady and unafraid. Behind me, she remained a quiet presence in my life, not as a crutch or a comfort, but as a teacher of truth, a witness to the moment when I chose myself over convenience. And somehow that made everything feel whole. The connection didn't need to end in romance to leave its mark. It had already done its work. By the time I turned the corner and the building was out of sight, I knew this wasn't a goodbye filled with loss. It was a parting that left both of us stronger, clearer, and ready to face the rest of our lives honestly. And that, I realized, was the truest form of love there could be.